Have you ever wondered why the people who seem to care the most at work often end up feeling the most betrayed? There's a cruel paradox in professional environments that nobody talks about openly. The very qualities that make you an exceptional colleague, loyalty, trust, genuine care for others, are often the same qualities that leave you vulnerable to the deepest disappointments. While everyone else seems to navigate workplace relationships with calculated detachment, you're the one placing flowers among groceries, offering genuine help, investing real emotional energy in connections that feel meaningful. And then, in a single moment of devastating clarity, you discover that your carefully built relationship was never what you thought it was. There's something profound about those quiet moments when kindness feels like a foreign language in our daily routines. The grocery store bagger had watched her for weeks. This woman in the yellow blouse who moved through the aisles with a solitude that seemed almost deliberate. While other customers rushed past in their self-absorbed bubbles, she took her time, reading labels, comparing prices, existing in her own careful world. It struck him how rarely anyone truly sees the people around them, how we've all become experts at looking without observing. Her consistent presence became a small anchor in his otherwise repetitive days, a reminder that beneath the surface of mundane transactions, real human stories unfold. When he finally offered to help carry her bags, it wasn't just courtesy, it was recognition of shared humanity. Trust, he'd learned, often begins with the smallest gestures of genuine care. The surprise in her eyes when he made that simple offer revealed something deeper about the professional environment we've all come to accept. "You're different. You seem to care," she said, and those words carried the weight of countless interactions where care had been absent. In workplaces across the world, we've somehow normalized indifference, treating colleagues as fixtures rather than fellow travelers navigating their own complex lives. Her comment wasn't just about him. It was an indictment of how rare authentic concern has become in our daily interactions. The loyalty we crave from others often starts with the loyalty we show to our own capacity for compassion. When someone notices that you actually see them, it creates a ripple effect that can transform entire environments. But here's what most people don't realize about these moments of connection. They're also moments of vulnerability that can lead us down unexpected paths. What happened next reveals a truth about human nature that most relationship experts won't tell you. He began leaving flowers among her groceries, a gesture so subtle, it bordered on invisible, yet so intentional, it transformed ordinary shopping trips into something resembling courtship. This wasn't just about romantic interest. It was about creating meaning in meaningless spaces, about finding beauty in the mundane corners of our professional lives. The frustration with routine had led him to inject poetry into produce aisles, to make art out of customer service. But here's where the story takes a turn that connects to something much larger about betrayal in our work relationships. When we invest emotional energy in people who haven't asked for it, we're often setting ourselves up for lessons we never intended to learn. The flowers weren't just gestures. They were investments in a narrative that existed primarily in his imagination. The fourth day brought a revelation that every person who's ever worked closely with others will recognize viscerally. Watching her leave hand in hand with the manager, laughing with the ease of established intimacy, he experienced that particular brand of professional betrayal that cuts deeper than we expect. It wasn't just about romantic disappointment. It was about the sudden realization that the connections we think we're building exist in isolation, while others are weaving entirely different stories. The professional environment becomes a stage where we're all performing our roles, often unaware of the other plays happening simultaneously. His carefully constructed narrative of gradual connection crumbled in the face of an established relationship he'd never seen coming. Deception isn't just disappointment. It's the gap between what we believed was happening and what was actually happening. The manager's laughter echoed with the sound of assumptions being shattered, a reminder that in workplaces, information flows in channels we're not always privy to. The silence that followed his discovery speaks to something universal about how we process betrayal in professional settings. He squeezed that cardboard box, not just in frustration, but in recognition of his own naivety, his own willingness to construct elaborate emotional narratives around minimal interactions. Every workplace has these moments, When the collaborative project you thought was building towards something meaningful gets reassigned. When the mentor you trusted shares your ideas without credit. When the colleague you supported gets the promotion you deserved. The continued stacking of boxes became a meditation on acceptance, a physical rhythm that matched the internal work of rebuilding expectations. Learning to separate professional kindness from personal investment is one of the most challenging aspects of maintaining our emotional health in work environments. The boxes represented not just inventory, but the weight of recalibrated relationships. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is simply continuing to do your job well, while internally adjusting your understanding of who you're working with and why. When his colleague finally provided context, she always had a thing with the manager. They say he gives her discounts. It revealed another layer of workplace dynamics that most people prefer to ignore. Information in professional environments rarely travels in straight lines. It moves through informal networks, creating insiders and outsiders, those who know and those who assume. The colleague's casual comment carried the weight of institutional knowledge, the kind of understanding that comes from paying attention to patterns rather than individual moments. This revelation transformed his perception of their interaction from potential romance to workplace politics, from personal connection to professional maneuvering. The loyalty he'd felt toward his imagined relationship had to be redirected toward a more realistic understanding of his position in the larger organizational structure. Trust, he realized, requires not just goodwill but accurate information about the systems we're operating within. The discount mentioned wasn't just about money. It was about access, about relationships that create advantages, about the informal economies that exist within every workplace. His response the next day, "The bags I'll carry. The rest I'm learning to leave behind," represents a masterclass in professional boundary setting that most people never learn. When she tried to engage him in conversation, he'd already done the internal work of separating his job responsibilities from his emotional investments. This wasn't coldness, it was clarity about what belongs in professional relationships and what belongs elsewhere. The super-assent he demonstrated wasn't about getting over her, but about getting over his own tendency to read too much into workplace interactions. Months later, when his promotion to head stockist came through and she returned alone, he had the wisdom to see her but not approach. The boxes he carried had multiplied, representing not just professional advancement, but emotional sophistication. The illusions he'd lost weren't just about one person. They were about how professional environments really work, how trust and loyalty function in institutional settings, and how the most important learning often comes from our most uncomfortable realizations about ourselves and others. The moment she expressed surprise at his kindness revealed something most people never recognize about workplace dynamics, how rare genuine care has become in our professional interactions. "You're different. You seem to care," she said, and those words should have been a warning rather than encouragement. When someone points out that basic human decency makes you stand out, it's often because they're operating in an environment where such decency is scarce or strategically deployed. The professional environment has conditioned us to view kindness with suspicion, yet we still crave it desperately when it appears authentic. Her comment wasn't just observation. It was an invitation into a game where the rules weren't clearly defined. Trust builds slowly in healthy relationships, but in workplace settings, it can be manufactured quickly by those who understand which emotional buttons to press. The loyalty we show to people who seem to appreciate our better qualities often blinds us to their motivations for encouraging those qualities. What happened in those following days illustrates a principle that relationship experts rarely discuss openly: how small, consistent gestures can create emotional dependency without explicit commitment. The flowers hidden among her groceries weren't just romantic gestures. They were investments in a narrative of specialness, of being chosen, of having her mundane shopping experience transformed into something magical. She began to anticipate these surprises, to look forward to discovering what thoughtful touch he'd added to her routine this time. The frustration with ordinary life makes us vulnerable to anyone who promises to make our days more meaningful, more noticed, more special. But here's what most people don't understand about these carefully orchestrated moments. They're often auditions for attention rather than expressions of genuine affection. The professional environment provides perfect cover for this kind of emotional manipulation because it appears innocent, helpful, service-oriented. When someone consistently goes above and beyond in small ways, we rarely question their deeper motivations. The dynamic that developed between them reveals something crucial about how betrayal often begins with kindness rather than cruelty. She started to depend on his attention, to structure her shopping trips around the possibility of these small surprises, to feel special because someone had noticed her patterns and cared enough to enhance them. This dependency wasn't love. It was the preliminary work of emotional manipulation, the creation of a connection that served her need to feel valued while serving his need to feel important. The deception that would come later was built into this foundation, but she couldn't see it because the attention felt so genuine, so different from the transactional nature of most workplace interactions. What she didn't realize was that her manager had been watching this entire courtship unfold, calculating its implications for his own established relationship with his favorite customer. The flowers weren't just hidden among the produce. They were hidden from the larger context of workplace politics and established hierarchies. The fourth day's revelation, seeing her leave hand in hand with the manager, exposed the reality that she'd been playing multiple games simultaneously. While accepting the bagger's thoughtful gestures and expressing appreciation for his unique care, she'd been maintaining an entirely different relationship with someone who had actual power in that environment. The professional setting had provided her with the perfect cover for emotional multitasking, for being the recipient of one person's romantic attention while pursuing another person's professional advantages. Her laughter with the manager wasn't just joy. It was the sound of someone who'd successfully managed two relationships for maximum benefit. The betrayal wasn't just about choosing the manager over the bagger. It was about allowing the bagger to build emotional investment, while she knew full well where her real interests lay. Trust had been weaponized, used as a tool to keep him engaged while she pursued more advantageous connections. The workplace had become a theater, where she performed appreciation while orchestrating a completely different ending. The silence that followed his discovery wasn't just disappointment. It was the sound of someone learning a fundamental truth about how some people navigate professional relationships. She'd never explicitly promised him anything, never made commitments that could be called broken, never lied about her availability or intentions. Yet the betrayal felt complete because she'd encouraged his investment, accepted his gifts, praised his uniqueness, all while knowing she was committed elsewhere. The frustration he felt wasn't just about unrequited affection. It was about being used as an emotional supplement, while someone else enjoyed the main course. Learning to recognize this pattern is crucial for anyone who works closely with others, because the same dynamic appears in professional contexts constantly. Colleagues who encourage your extra efforts while pursuing opportunities elsewhere, managers who praise your dedication while planning your replacement, team members who accept your support while building alliances that exclude you. The superassume required isn't just getting over one person's choices, but developing radar for when your emotional generosity is being harvested rather than reciprocated. When his colleague finally provided context, she always had a thing with the manager. They say he gives her discounts. It revealed how workplace betrayals often happen in plain sight while some people remain deliberately uninformed. The institutional knowledge about her established relationship had been available all along, but he'd been too focused on his own narrative to seek out the larger context. This is how betrayal functions in professional environments, not through sudden shocking revelations, but through the gradual realization that everyone else knew what you were too invested to see. The loyalty he'd shown to his romantic fantasy had prevented him from showing loyalty to his own need for accurate information about the situation he was entering. Trust without verification isn't trust. It's wishful thinking disguised as virtue. The discounts she received weren't just financial benefits. They were symbols of an established relationship that had economic, professional, and personal dimensions he'd never bothered to investigate. The apprendizado here isn't about avoiding connections with colleagues, but about gathering information before making emotional investments. His final response, "The bags I'll carry. The rest, I'm learning to leave behind," represents the kind of professional wisdom that only comes from experience with workplace betrayal. When she returned months later, trying to re-engage with someone who'd been promoted beyond her reach, he demonstrated the clarity that comes from understanding the difference between professional obligation and personal choice. The professional environment had taught him to separate what he owed to customers as an employee from what he owed to people as a person. She'd forfeited access to his personal investment through her strategic manipulation, but she still deserved professional service. The boxes he carried had multiplied with his promotion, but the illusions he carried had been permanently reduced. This wasn't coldness. It was the practical application of lessons learned about how some people use workplace kindness as a renewable resource, always available for extraction but never reciprocated with honesty. The greatest betrayal wasn't her choice of the manager over him. It was her choice to keep him emotionally invested while she knew that choice had already been made. The act of hiding flowers among groceries reveals something profound about how we try to inject meaning into mundane professional interactions. Those carefully placed blooms weren't just romantic gestures. They were attempts to transform routine customer service into something resembling courtship, to make ordinary work feel extraordinary through secret acts of beauty. The professional environment becomes a stage for these hidden performances, where we create elaborate emotional narratives around the smallest interactions with colleagues or customers. He'd discovered that adding poetry to produce aisles gave him a sense of purpose beyond the repetitive nature of his job, a way to feel like he was contributing something unique to someone's day. The trust he placed in these gestures was really trust in his own ability to create meaningful connections through sustained thoughtfulness. But what most people don't realize about these carefully orchestrated surprises is how they can become forms of emotional manipulation, even when the intentions feel pure. The loyalty he showed to this ritual was actually loyalty to a fantasy about what customer appreciation could become. Each flower represented not just a gift, but an investment in a story he was writing about their connection. The frustration with ordinary life had led him to create this elaborate system of secret communication, turning her shopping trips into treasure hunts where the prize was the evidence that someone cared enough to notice her patterns and preferences. She began to anticipate these discoveries, to look forward to finding what thoughtful surprise he'd hidden among her usual purchases, to feel special because her routine had been transformed into something magical. The professional setting provided perfect cover for this courtship because it appeared to be exceptional customer service rather than personal pursuit. What she didn't understand was that accepting these gifts was creating an emotional contract she'd never explicitly agreed to, building expectations about appreciation and reciprocation that would later feel like betrayal when they weren't met. The deception was being constructed flower by flower, gesture by gesture, assumption by assumption. The workplace had become a garden where he was planting seeds of connection, while she was simply enjoying the blooms without considering their source or implications. The ritual of placing flowers among fruits created a dangerous precedent about how professional relationships could blur into personal territory. He'd found a way to express romantic interest that felt safe because it was deniable. If confronted, he could claim it was just exceptional customer service, just trying to brighten someone's day. But the consistent pattern revealed deeper intentions that transformed ordinary grocery transactions into something resembling a relationship. The professional environment became complicit in this emotional ambiguity, providing space for connections that couldn't exist in clearer contexts. She appreciated the gestures without questioning their implications, enjoying the special treatment without considering the emotional investment behind it. This dynamic reveals something crucial about workplace betrayals. They often begin with kindness that crosses invisible boundaries, creating expectations and dependencies that neither person has explicitly acknowledged. The super-assistant would later require him to understand that his generosity had been strategic, even if unconsciously so, designed to create the very appreciation and dependency that made her eventual betrayal feel so devastating. But here's where the story reveals a deeper truth about how some people navigate professional attention and personal advantage simultaneously. While she was accepting his flowers and expressing genuine appreciation for his thoughtfulness, she was also maintaining an entirely different relationship with the manager, one that provided actual benefits rather than symbolic gestures. The betrayal wasn't just about her romantic choice. It was about her ability to compartmentalize emotional experiences, to receive one person's gifts while pursuing another person's advantages. The professional setting had given her perfect cover for this dual navigation, allowing her to be genuinely touched by the bagger's attention while remaining strategically focused on the manager's power. The flowers hidden among groceries were beautiful, but they couldn't compete with discounts hidden in transaction records. Learning to recognize this pattern is crucial for anyone working in environments where personal and professional boundaries blur regularly. Trust becomes complicated when someone can genuinely appreciate your efforts while simultaneously investing their real energy elsewhere. The moment he discovered her established relationship with the manager, those carefully placed flowers transformed from gestures of love into evidence of his own naivety. Every bloom he'd hidden became a reminder of how he'd been building a fantasy while she'd been managing reality, how he'd been investing in symbolism while she'd been securing actual advantages. The frustration he felt wasn't just about romantic rejection. It was about the realization that his elaborate courtship had been taking place in a context he'd completely misunderstood. The professional environment had provided the stage for his romantic theater, but it had also been hosting an entirely different drama involving established relationships and institutional power. His flowers were props in a play he didn't know he was performing, while the real action was happening in meetings and transactions he'd never been privy to. The loyalty he'd shown to his romantic ritual had blinded him to the larger dynamics at play in their shared workplace. The apprendizado required wasn't just about accepting rejection, but about understanding how workplace relationships operate on multiple levels simultaneously. When his colleague revealed the institutional knowledge about her established relationship, she always had a thing with the manager. It became clear that his flower hiding ritual had been visible to everyone except the person who most needed to see its futility. The professional environment holds information in informal networks that don't always reach the people most affected by that information. His romantic gestures had been touching to her and obvious to his colleagues, but irrelevant to the larger dynamics that actually determined relationship outcomes in their workplace. The betrayal expanded beyond her personal choices to include the system that had allowed him to remain uninformed while everyone else understood the context of his efforts. Trust in workplace relationships requires not just faith in individuals, but understanding of the institutional structures that shape how those relationships develop and resolve. The flowers had been beautiful gestures in isolation, but they'd been planted in soil that could never support the kind of growth he'd imagined. The deception wasn't just about her choosing someone else. It was about discovering that his entire approach had been based on incomplete information about how their professional environment actually functioned. His eventual promotion to head stockist and her return as a solitary customer created the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the wisdom that comes from experience with workplace betrayal. When he saw her but chose not to approach, he was applying lessons learned about the difference between professional obligation and personal investment. The flowers had taught him that romantic gestures without context can become forms of self-deception, that kindness without boundaries can become manipulation, that professional environments can host personal dramas but they don't guarantee personal outcomes. She'd returned to a version of him that understood the separation between job responsibilities and emotional availability. The boxes he carried had multiplied with his advancement, but his willingness to carry other people's emotional expectations had been permanently reduced. This wasn't coldness. It was the practical application of hard-won understanding about how workplace relationships actually function. The illusions he'd lost weren't just about one person's capacity for loyalty, but about his own tendency to create elaborate emotional narratives around minimal professional interactions. The flowers had bloomed and wilted, but the lessons they'd taught continued to grow. The moment of discovery, seeing her leave hand in hand with the manager, laughing as if the world belonged to them, represents one of those crystalline instances where workplace reality shatters carefully constructed personal narratives. Their laughter wasn't just joy, it was the sound of established intimacy, of shared jokes and comfortable familiarity that had been developing while he'd been placing flowers among groceries. The professional environment had been hosting two completely different stories simultaneously: his careful courtship through customer service and their established relationship that carried both personal and institutional weight. What struck him most wasn't just the romantic betrayal, but the realization that he'd been performing his elaborate ritual of care in front of an audience that included the very person who'd already claimed the prize he was pursuing. Trust, he learned in that moment, requires not just faith in people's intentions but awareness of the larger context in which those intentions operate. The loyalty he'd shown to his romantic fantasy had prevented him from gathering the institutional knowledge that would have saved him from this devastation. Their synchronized laughter echoed with the confidence of people who'd never doubted their connection, never questioned their priority, never worried about competition from grocery store employees. The ease with which they moved together revealed something profound about how established relationships function within professional environments. This wasn't a new romance or a recent development. This was the comfort of people who'd already navigated the complexities of mixing personal connection with workplace hierarchy. Her hand in his carried the weight of shared decisions, mutual understanding, and probably countless conversations about the naive bagger who'd been trying to court her through produce arrangements. The frustration he felt wasn't just about being excluded from a relationship he'd wanted. It was about being included in conversations and considerations he'd never known were happening. The professional setting had provided perfect cover for their established connection, allowing them to maintain the appearance of separate professional roles while operating as a unified personal unit. The deception expanded beyond romantic disappointment to encompass a complete misunderstanding of how power, relationships, and workplace dynamics actually intersected in his environment. Their laughter contained years of shared experience that made his weeks of flower placing seem not just futile, but almost comically insignificant. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was institutional, revealing how the formal structures of their workplace had been secondary to the informal networks of established relationships. What made this discovery particularly devastating was how it recontextualized every interaction he'd had with both of them. The manager's casual professionalism during their few exchanges now seemed like benevolent tolerance rather than collegial respect. Her appreciation for his thoughtfulness transformed from genuine surprise at his kindness into polite acknowledgement of his efforts, while her attention remained focused elsewhere. The professional environment had allowed all of them to maintain their official roles, while an entirely different drama played out beneath the surface. He'd been the only one operating with incomplete information, the only one who didn't understand that the game had already been decided before he'd started playing. Trust becomes complicated when the social and professional contexts provide such perfect cover for established relationships that newcomers can't distinguish between availability and politeness. The super-SM required wouldn't just be accepting her choice, but accepting his own role in constructing a fantasy that had never been grounded in accurate information about the relationships that already existed. Their confident intimacy spoke to months or years of connection that rendered his recent romantic gestures not just unsuccessful, but irrelevant. The silence of his discovery reveals something universal about how we process betrayal in professional settings. Often, the most devastating realizations happen in public spaces, where we must continue performing our roles while internally restructuring our understanding of reality. He couldn't collapse, couldn't confront, couldn't even acknowledge what he'd learned, because the grocery store demanded that he continue stacking boxes and serving customers as if nothing had changed. The professional environment that had enabled his romantic fantasy also constrained his response to learning that fantasy had been impossible from the beginning. This dynamic appears constantly in workplace betrayals. The necessity of maintaining professional composure while processing personal devastation, of continuing collaborative relationships while absorbing the knowledge that collaboration was never what you thought it was. Learning to function professionally while your personal understanding of relationships gets completely reorganized is one of the most challenging aspects of workplace emotional intelligence. The loyalty he'd shown to his version of reality had to be immediately redirected toward the professional obligations that couldn't be abandoned just because his personal hopes had been shattered. The apprendizado happening in that moment wasn't just about romantic disappointment. It was about the gap between public roles and private relationships, about how professional environments can simultaneously enable and constrain emotional expression. Their easy intimacy also revealed how workplace hierarchies create different categories of access and information. The manager's position didn't just give him authority over store operations, it gave him social access that employees at other levels couldn't achieve. Her connection to him wasn't just personal, it was an alignment with institutional power that provided benefits ranging from professional opportunities to social status within their work environment. The betrayal expanded beyond personal choice to include systemic realities about how relationships form and function within organizational structures. She'd chosen not just a person but a position, not just romance but resources, not just affection but advantage. The professional environment had taught her that personal and professional benefits often come packaged together, that romantic relationships within workplace hierarchies carry implications that extend far beyond emotional connection. His flowers had been beautiful gestures, but they'd been competing against benefits that included both personal compatibility and professional positioning. Trust in workplace relationships becomes complicated when romantic feelings intersect with institutional advantages. When choosing one person over another means choosing one level of access and opportunity over another. The institutional knowledge that his colleague later shared, she always had a thing with the manager. They say he gives her discounts, revealed that their relationship had been common knowledge among employees while remaining invisible to customers, and apparently to anyone too focused on their own romantic hopes to gather relevant information. The professional environment holds these informal networks of knowledge that can completely change how official interactions should be interpreted, but that information doesn't automatically reach the people who most need it. The betrayal included not just her choice and his naivety, but the system that had allowed him to operate with such incomplete understanding of the relationships that actually determined social dynamics in their workplace. Their laughter had been the sound of people who'd never worried about his competition, because they'd never considered him competition, who'd appreciated his kindness without feeling threatened by his intentions, because they'd known from the beginning that those intentions had no realistic path to success. The frustration with this discovery wasn't just romantic disappointment. It was the realization that everyone else had been operating with information that would have prevented his emotional investment if he'd known to seek it out. His response to this revelation, the continued stacking in silence, represents a masterclass in professional dignity that most people never develop. The deception could have led to confrontation, to public displays of hurt feelings, to attempts to make them uncomfortable with the consequences of their established relationship. Instead, he absorbed the new information, adjusted his understanding of his situation, and continued performing his job responsibilities with the same competence he'd shown before. The professional environment had taught him that personal devastation doesn't excuse professional incompetence, that workplace betrayals require internal processing rather than external drama. This restraint wasn't suppression, it was the beginning of wisdom about how to separate personal hopes from professional obligations, how to maintain your effectiveness in environments where your emotional investments haven't been reciprocated. The boxes he continued stacking represented not just inventory, but the weight of recalibrated expectations, the physical rhythm that matched the internal work of rebuilding his understanding of how workplace relationships actually function. The superação happening in that silence was profound. The transformation from someone who mixed personal fantasy with professional interaction into someone who understood the boundaries that keep both functioning effectively. The fact that she didn't even look back reveals something profound about how some people navigate the aftermath of workplace emotional situations they've helped create. Her forward momentum with the manager wasn't just about embracing a chosen relationship. It was about the complete dismissal of alternative emotional investments that had been occurring in her peripheral vision. The professional environment had allowed her to maintain plausible deniability about his romantic intentions, while accepting the benefits of his attention, and now that same environment provided cover for moving forward without acknowledgement or closure. She'd never explicitly encouraged his hopes, never made promises that could be called broken, yet her failure to even glance back suggested an awareness that looking might require some form of accountability for the emotional investment she'd allowed him to build. Trust becomes complicated when people can accept kindness without accepting responsibility for how that kindness is interpreted. The loyalty she owed to her established relationship apparently included loyalty to the fiction that his attention had been purely professional. Her forward focus wasn't just about embracing her choice. It was about avoiding the discomfort of seeing the consequences of that choice written on someone else's face. His response, squeezing the cardboard box and continuing to stack in silence, represents one of the most sophisticated forms of professional emotional regulation that exists. The frustration he felt could have exploded into confrontation, could have demanded explanation, could have tried to make his pain her problem to solve. Instead, he channeled that energy into the physical rhythm of his work, using the repetitive motion of stacking as a form of meditation on acceptance. The professional environment demanded that he continue functioning regardless of personal disappointment, and he discovered that meeting that demand was actually therapeutic rather than suppressive. The boxes became containers, not just for merchandise, but for his recalibrated expectations about how workplace relationships function. This wasn't emotional suppression. It was the practical application of understanding that some forms of pain are private burdens that must be processed internally rather than externally dramatized. The deception he was absorbing wasn't just about her choice, but about his own naivety in constructing romantic narratives around professional interactions. The super-assault happening in that silence was profound. The transformation from someone who expected emotional reciprocity to someone who understood the boundaries that keep professional environments functional. What most people don't understand about this kind of workplace betrayal is how it reveals the gap between emotional investment and actual relationship status. He'd been building connection through consistent acts of service and thoughtfulness, operating under the assumption that appreciation indicated availability and interest suggested possibility. She'd been receiving that service and appreciation without ever confirming that his assumptions were accurate, allowing him to construct a narrative that served her immediate comfort while serving his romantic hopes. The professional setting had provided perfect cover for this miscommunication, because customer service naturally includes elements of personal attention and care that can be misinterpreted as romantic interest. The betrayal wasn't that she'd chosen someone else. It was that she'd allowed him to invest emotionally, while she knew that investment had no realistic foundation. Trust in workplace relationships requires explicit communication about intentions and boundaries, not just acceptance of gestures and services. The loyalty he'd shown to his version of their connection had prevented him from seeking clarity about her version of that same connection. Learning to distinguish between professional politeness and personal interest is one of the most crucial skills for maintaining emotional health in work environments. The silence that followed her departure became a form of institutional education about how workplace hierarchies actually function. His romantic gestures had been taking place at the customer service level, focused on enhancing her experience as a shopper, while her established relationship existed at the management level, focused on leveraging institutional power for mutual benefit. The professional environment had multiple levels of access and connection, and he'd been operating at a level that simply couldn't compete with established relationships that included both personal compatibility and professional advantage. Her failure to look back wasn't just personal dismissal, it was institutional dismissal, the natural result of someone who'd already secured access to higher levels of workplace benefit, choosing not to acknowledge efforts made at lower levels. The frustration he felt wasn't just romantic disappointment. It was the discovery that his position in their workplace hierarchy had predetermined the futility of his romantic efforts. The apprendizado required was about understanding not just personal relationship dynamics, but organizational relationship dynamics, not just individual choice, but systemic advantage. Trust becomes complicated when romantic feelings intersect with institutional structures that create different categories of access, influence, and opportunity. His continued stacking represented more than professional obligation. It was a form of active meditation on the difference between what we can control and what we cannot control in workplace relationships. The boxes he moved were concrete, manageable, stackable in ways that relationships are not. The rhythm of physical work provided structure for processing emotional disappointment, a way to channel frustration into productivity rather than allowing it to become workplace drama. The professional environment had taught him that personal disappointment doesn't excuse professional incompetence, that maintaining his effectiveness as an employee was separate from processing his feelings as a person interested in romance. This separation wasn't compartmentalization, it was integration, the understanding that work relationships function best when personal hopes don't override professional responsibilities. The betrayal he'd experienced was teaching him invaluable lessons about emotional regulation, about the importance of gathering accurate information before making emotional investments, about the difference between professional kindness and personal availability. The deception was transforming into wisdom about how to navigate complex social environments without losing either professional effectiveness or personal dignity. What made his response particularly sophisticated was how it avoided the trap of making his emotional experience her problem to solve. She'd made her choice based on her own priorities and preferences, and demanding explanation or acknowledgement would have been an attempt to make his disappointment her responsibility. The professional environment requires that we process personal setbacks without creating professional complications for others, that we maintain collaborative effectiveness even when collaboration hasn't led to the personal outcomes we'd hoped for. His silence wasn't passive aggression, it was active acceptance of reality, combined with a commitment to professional excellence that didn't depend on personal satisfaction. The loyalty he'd been showing to his romantic hopes was redirected toward loyalty to his own professional development and emotional growth. The superassault happening in those moments of continued stacking was remarkable. The transformation from someone who needed external validation to maintain motivation into someone who could find internal motivation, even in the face of external disappointment. The boxes multiplied around him, but the illusions that had been weighing him down were finally being set aside, creating space for more realistic and sustainable approaches to workplace relationships. The institutional lesson embedded in this experience extends far beyond romantic disappointment to encompass fundamental truths about how professional environments balance personal feelings with operational necessities. Her ability to move forward without looking back wasn't cruelty. It was the practical application of understanding that workplace relationships must function according to professional requirements rather than personal comfort. His ability to continue stacking without confrontation wasn't suppression. It was the practical application of understanding that emotional processing happens internally, while professional responsibilities continue externally. The trust they'd both placed in the professional environment to contain and manage their personal interaction had been justified. The system had allowed for his romantic gesture, her polite reception, and both of their continued effectiveness in their respective roles. The betrayal had occurred, the disappointment had been absorbed, and the work had continued, demonstrating that workplace environments can accommodate personal drama without being derailed by it, as long as the people involved maintain their commitment to professional function over personal satisfaction. The colleague's casual comment, "She always had a thing with the manager. They say he gives her discounts," reveals something profound about how information flows through workplace environments and how institutional knowledge can completely recontextualize personal experiences. This wasn't malicious gossip. It was the sharing of common knowledge that had apparently been available to everyone except the person who most needed it. The professional environment creates these informal networks of information that operate parallel to official structures, carrying details about relationships, advantages, and dynamics that don't appear in employee handbooks or organizational charts. His colleague's matter-of-fact delivery suggested this information had never been secret or sensitive. It was simply part of the background knowledge that long-term employees accumulated about how their workplace actually functioned. The betrayal expanded beyond her personal choice to include the realization that he'd been operating with incomplete information, while everyone else understood the full context of the relationships he'd been trying to navigate. Trust in workplace relationships requires not just faith in individuals, but awareness of the systems and histories that shape how those relationships develop and function. The mention of discounts wasn't just about financial benefits. It was about access, privilege, and the kind of informal advantages that come with established relationships in professional environments. Her connection to the manager provided her with benefits that extended far beyond romantic companionship into practical advantages that affected her daily experience as a customer. The professional setting had become a space where personal relationships translated directly into material benefits, where romantic connection included economic advantage, where choosing one person over another meant choosing one level of access over another. The frustration he felt wasn't just about romantic competition. It was about discovering that he'd been competing in a game where the stakes included resources and advantages he'd never even known were available. The loyalty she'd shown to her established relationship included loyalty to the practical benefits that came with that relationship, benefits that his flowers and thoughtfulness could never provide. Learning to recognize these dynamics is crucial for anyone working in environments where personal and professional advantages intersect regularly. The deception wasn't just about her choosing someone else. It was about discovering that romantic relationships in workplace settings often carry implications that extend far beyond emotional connection. What makes this revelation particularly significant is how it exposed the gap between his understanding of customer service and the reality of how customer relationships actually functioned in their environment. He'd been providing exceptional service to someone who was already receiving exceptional service through entirely different channels, service that included benefits he wasn't authorized to provide and advantages he couldn't access. The professional environment had multiple tiers of customer experience, and he'd been operating at the standard level while she'd been receiving premium treatment through her personal connection to management. His careful attention to her shopping experience had been redundant, a beautiful but unnecessary supplement to advantages she was already enjoying through her established relationship. The institutional knowledge his colleagues shared revealed that his romantic gestures had been taking place in a context where she'd already secured the kind of special treatment that made his special treatment seem ordinary by comparison. Trust becomes complicated when workplace relationships include access to resources and advantages that aren't equally available to all participants. The superassumption required was understanding not just personal relationship dynamics, but institutional relationship dynamics. Not just individual choice, but systemic advantage. The casual way this information was shared, they say he gives her discounts, reveals how workplace communities often function as informal surveillance networks, where personal relationships become community knowledge. His colleague's comment wasn't revelation. It was confirmation of details that had been observed, discussed, and understood by multiple people over time. The professional environment had provided cover for their relationship, while simultaneously making that relationship visible to anyone who knew how to read the signs. The betrayal included not just her choices and his naivety, but the community knowledge that had been available to him, if he'd known to seek it out, or pay attention to the right conversations. Learning to navigate workplace social networks requires understanding that information about relationships, advantages, and dynamics flows through informal channels that don't always reach everyone equally. The loyalty he'd shown to his romantic fantasy had prevented him from showing loyalty to his own need for accurate information about the environment he was operating in. The apprendizado wasn't just about romantic disappointment. It was about the importance of understanding the full context of workplace relationships before making emotional investments. The timing of this revelation, after he'd already discovered their relationship himself, speaks to something important about how workplace communities handle sensitive information. His colleague hadn't volunteered this context while he was placing flowers and building romantic hopes. The information only emerged after the situation had resolved itself naturally. This pattern appears constantly in professional environments. People know relevant information but don't share it until after it's no longer actionable, either because they don't want to interfere with personal choices or because they don't realize how much their colleagues need that information. The professional setting creates these ethical dilemmas about when to share institutional knowledge and when to allow people to learn through experience. The frustration he felt wasn't just about the missed opportunity to avoid emotional investment. It was about the realization that his workplace community had been observing his romantic efforts while knowing they were futile. Trust in workplace relationships becomes complicated when community knowledge doesn't automatically translate into community support or guidance. The deception included not just romantic disappointment, but social disappointment, The discovery that collegial relationships don't always include the kind of protective information sharing that could prevent emotional harm. What his colleague's comment revealed most clearly was how established workplace relationships create ecosystems of advantage that newcomers or outsiders can't easily access or compete with. The discounts weren't just financial benefits. They were symbols of a relationship that had institutional support, management approval, and community recognition. Her connection to the manager provided her with a form of workplace citizenship that included privileges and access that weren't available to regular customers, regardless of how exceptional their service experience might be. The professional environment had become stratified, not just by official hierarchy, but by informal relationships that created different categories of treatment and opportunity. His romantic gestures had been competing against an established system of advantages that operated at levels he didn't even know existed. The loyalty she'd shown to her relationship with the manager was also loyalty to the practical benefits that relationship provided, benefits that extended far beyond emotional connection into daily material advantages. Learning to recognize these dynamics is essential for anyone working in environments where personal relationships intersect with professional benefits and institutional access. The broader institutional lesson embedded in this revelation extends to fundamental truths about how workplace environments balance formal equity with informal advantage. The professional setting officially provided equal customer service to all shoppers, but unofficially provided enhanced service to shoppers with personal connections to management. This dynamic appears in virtually every workplace. The gap between official policies and actual practices, between stated equality and practiced preference, between formal structures and informal advantages. His colleague's casual mention of the discounts wasn't gossip. It was education about how their workplace actually functioned beyond its official customer service policies. The trust he'd placed in the idea that exceptional service could create exceptional relationships had been misplaced because exceptional relationships already existed and provided advantages that service alone couldn't match. The supervision required was developing understanding of not just personal relationship dynamics, but institutional relationship dynamics, not just individual choice, but systemic advantage. The apprendizado was about the importance of gathering accurate information about workplace ecosystems before making emotional or professional investments, about understanding how formal and informal power structures intersect to create different categories of access and opportunity. His response, "The bags I'll carry, the rest I'm learning to leave behind," represents a masterclass in professional boundary setting that most people never develop even after decades of workplace experience. When she attempted to engage him in conversation the day after his discovery, she was testing whether their previous dynamic could be restored, whether his romantic disappointment would translate into professional awkwardness or continued availability for the emotional support she'd grown accustomed to receiving. His reply demonstrated the kind of clarity that only comes from experiencing betrayal and choosing growth over resentment. The professional environment had taught him to separate his job responsibilities from his personal investments, to maintain excellent customer service while protecting himself from further emotional manipulation. This wasn't coldness. It was wisdom about the difference between what he owed to customers as an employee and what he owed to people as a person. The trust he'd previously placed in the possibility of romantic connection had been redirected toward trust in his own ability to maintain professional standards while setting personal boundaries. The loyalty he now showed was to his own emotional well-being rather than to other people's comfort with his availability. What makes this response particularly sophisticated is how it acknowledged both his professional obligations and his personal limits without creating drama or requiring her to manage his feelings. She'd probably expected either continued romantic pursuit or hostile withdrawal, the typical responses to workplace romantic disappointment. Instead, he offered a third option: professional competence combined with personal boundaries, service without the emotional investment that had previously accompanied that service. The frustration he'd experienced with discovering her established relationship had been transformed into clarity about how workplace relationships should function when personal hopes don't align with professional realities. His willingness to carry her bags represented his commitment to excellent customer service regardless of personal disappointment. His unwillingness to carry the rest represented his commitment to emotional self-protection and realistic expectations about what workplace interactions could and should provide. The professional environment had become a space where he could practice this separation, where he could demonstrate that personal setbacks don't have to compromise professional excellence. The deception he'd experienced was being transformed into superation through the practical application of healthy boundaries. The phrase, "I'm learning to leave behind," reveals something profound about how workplace betrayals can become educational opportunities rather than just sources of ongoing resentment. He wasn't claiming to have already mastered emotional detachment. He was acknowledging that developing appropriate boundaries is an ongoing process that requires conscious effort and practice. The professional setting had become his laboratory for learning how to separate job responsibilities from personal investments, how to maintain collaborative effectiveness while protecting his emotional energy. This honesty about his learning process was itself a form of boundary setting, a way of acknowledging her attempt to re-engage while making clear that his availability for that kind of engagement had fundamentally changed. Trust in workplace relationships, he was discovering, requires not just faith in other people's intentions, but accuracy about your own boundaries and limitations. The loyalty he'd previously shown to romantic possibilities was being redirected toward loyalty to his own emotional development and professional growth. The apprendizado happening in this moment wasn't just about one relationship. It was about developing the kind of emotional intelligence that would serve him in all future workplace interactions. Her attempt to initiate conversation after his discovery reveals something important about how people often try to maintain familiar dynamics even after those dynamics have been fundamentally altered by new information. She'd grown accustomed to his special attention, his emotional availability, his willingness to go above and beyond in their interactions. His romantic interest had provided her with a form of customer service that exceeded professional standards, and she may have hoped to maintain those benefits even after making clear that romantic reciprocation wasn't available. The professional environment had given her experience with receiving exceptional treatment from multiple sources simultaneously, and she might not have understood why discovering her relationship with the manager should change her access to exceptional treatment from the bagger. Her attempt to engage him socially was really an attempt to restore a dynamic that had served her comfort and convenience, regardless of how that dynamic had affected his emotional well-being. The betrayal extended beyond her initial choice to include her expectation that he would continue providing emotional labor and exceptional service, even after learning that his romantic investment had been irrelevant to her decision-making process. Trust becomes complicated when people expect to maintain the benefits of relationships they've fundamentally altered through their choices and revelations. The institutional wisdom embedded in his response extends far beyond romantic disappointment to encompass essential truths about how to maintain effectiveness in professional environments where personal feelings and workplace obligations intersect. His ability to separate customer service from personal investment demonstrated the kind of emotional regulation that allows people to function effectively in complex social environments without being derailed by individual disappointments or betrayals. The professional setting had taught him that excellent service doesn't require emotional investment, that professional competence can exist independently of personal satisfaction, that maintaining workplace effectiveness sometimes requires accepting personal disappointment without allowing that disappointment to compromise collaborative relationships. This separation wasn't compartmentalization, it was integration. The understanding that professional environments function best when personal hopes don't override professional responsibilities. The frustration he'd experienced was being channeled into wisdom about sustainable approaches to workplace relationships, approaches that could provide satisfaction and meaning without requiring reciprocation or romantic success. The superation happening in this conversation was remarkable. The transformation from someone who needed external validation to maintain motivation into someone who could find internal motivation and professional pride, even when external relationships didn't develop as hoped. What makes his boundary setting particularly effective is how it avoided both extremes of typical workplace romantic disappointment, neither hostile withdrawal nor continued pursuit. He offered her exactly what their professional relationship required, and nothing more, maintaining the kind of service excellence that his job demanded while protecting himself from further emotional manipulation or misunderstanding. The professional environment had become a space where he could practice healthy relationship dynamics, where he could demonstrate that personal boundaries enhance rather than compromise collaborative effectiveness. His response communicated respect for her choices while asserting respect for his own emotional well-being, acknowledging her comfort while prioritizing his own growth and development. The trust he now placed in workplace relationships was more sustainable because it was based on realistic expectations about what those relationships could provide and what they required from him. The loyalty he showed was to professional excellence rather than personal hope, to his own emotional development rather than other people's comfort with his availability. The apprendizado embedded in this interaction would serve him throughout his career. The understanding that workplace relationships function best when they're based on mutual respect and clear boundaries rather than unspoken hopes and unexamined expectations. His promotion months later and her solitary return created the perfect opportunity to demonstrate the long-term effectiveness of this approach to workplace boundary setting. When he saw her but chose not to approach, he was applying the lessons learned from their previous interaction about the difference between professional obligation and personal choice. She'd returned to find a version of him that understood the separation between job responsibilities and emotional availability, someone who had transformed personal disappointment into professional advancement and emotional wisdom. The professional environment had rewarded his commitment to excellence and emotional regulation, with increased responsibility and institutional recognition. The boxes he now carried had multiplied with his promotion, but his willingness to carry other people's emotional expectations had been permanently calibrated to sustainable levels. This wasn't coldness or resentment. It was the practical application of hard-won understanding about how workplace relationships actually function when they're based on mutual respect rather than unexamined hopes. The deception he'd experienced had been transformed into superação through the development of emotional intelligence, professional boundaries, and realistic expectations about what workplace interactions could and should provide for all parties involved. The promotion to head stockist represented more than professional advancement. It was institutional recognition that his approach to handling workplace disappointment had demonstrated the kind of emotional intelligence and reliability that organizations value in leadership positions. When she returned months later to find him in a position of increased responsibility and authority, the dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted in ways that extended far beyond their personal history. The professional environment had rewarded his commitment to excellence despite personal setbacks, his ability to maintain customer service standards while processing romantic disappointment, his capacity to separate job performance from emotional investment. The trust his supervisors had placed in him reflected their observation of how he'd handled a challenging personal situation without allowing it to compromise his professional effectiveness. His new role carrying more boxes wasn't just about increased inventory responsibility. It was about carrying the weight of institutional confidence in his judgment, reliability, and emotional regulation. The loyalty he'd shown to professional growth rather than personal resentment had been recognized and rewarded by the very system where his romantic hopes had been disappointed. The superação wasn't just personal, it was institutional, demonstrating that workplace environments can become spaces for transformation and advancement rather than just sources of betrayal and frustration. Her return as a solitary customer created a perfect test of the emotional boundaries and professional wisdom he'd developed through their previous interaction. She'd come back to a version of him that understood the difference between customer service obligations and personal availability, someone who had transformed disappointment into advancement and emotional confusion into clarity about workplace relationship dynamics. The professional setting that had once hosted his romantic gestures now provided the stage for demonstrating how those experiences had been converted into wisdom about sustainable approaches to workplace interactions. His decision to see her but not approach wasn't avoidance. It was the practical application of lessons learned about maintaining effectiveness in environments where personal and professional relationships intersect. The frustration he'd once felt about her choices had been transformed into understanding about his own boundaries and priorities. The deception that had once threatened to derail his professional focus had become the foundation for a more sophisticated approach to workplace relationships that served both his emotional well-being and his career advancement. The apprendizado embedded in his response demonstrated that workplace betrayals can become sources of wisdom rather than ongoing resentment when they're processed with commitment to growth rather than attachment to grievance. The contrast between his increased responsibilities and her unchanged customer status revealed something profound about how professional environments can provide alternative sources of satisfaction and meaning when romantic relationships don't develop as hoped. His promotion had given him access to new levels of institutional respect, responsibility, and recognition that existed independently of any individual customer's approval or romantic interest. The professional setting had become a space where he could build identity and satisfaction through competence and advancement, rather than through personal relationships that might or might not be reciprocated. The boxes he now carried represented not just inventory, but institutional trust, professional growth, and the kind of meaningful work that provides satisfaction regardless of romantic outcomes. His ability to see her without feeling compelled to approach demonstrated that his sense of worth and purpose had been successfully separated from her approval or attention. Trust in workplace environments, he'd learned, could be more sustainable than trust in individual relationships, because institutional recognition was based on demonstrated competence rather than emotional reciprocation. The loyalty he now showed was to his own professional development and the organizational responsibilities that had been entrusted to him, loyalties that would persist regardless of individual customers' choices or availability. His choice not to approach her when she returned alone speaks to something sophisticated about how emotional intelligence manifests in professional environments, knowing when engagement serves mutual benefit and when it serves only nostalgia or unfinished emotional business. She'd returned to find him in a context where his attention and energy were directed toward responsibilities that provided genuine satisfaction and institutional recognition, rather than toward personal relationships that might provide temporary validation but no sustainable foundation. The professional environment had taught him that maintaining boundaries doesn't require hostility or avoidance. It requires clarity about what interactions serve productive purposes and what interactions serve only emotional habits that no longer benefit anyone involved. His promotion had given him perspective on how workplace relationships function most effectively when they're based on mutual professional respect rather than unexamined personal hopes or historical emotional investments. The frustration he'd once felt about romantic disappointment had been transformed into wisdom about sustainable approaches to workplace interaction that protect everyone's emotional energy while maintaining collaborative effectiveness. The superasson demonstrated in this choice was remarkable. The transformation from someone who needed external validation to maintain professional motivation into someone who could find internal satisfaction through meaningful work and institutional advancement. The multiplication of boxes he now carried served as a perfect metaphor for how professional growth can provide alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction when personal relationships don't develop as expected. Each additional box represented increased institutional trust, expanded responsibility, and the kind of meaningful work that provides satisfaction regardless of romantic outcomes or individual customer relationships. The professional environment had become a space where he could build identity through competence rather than connection, where advancement came through demonstrated reliability rather than emotional investment in individual relationships. His ability to carry more boxes while carrying fewer illusions represented the practical wisdom that comes from understanding the difference between sustainable sources of satisfaction and temporary sources of validation. The betrayal he'd experienced had taught him to invest emotional energy in relationships and responsibilities that could provide reciprocal benefit rather than one-sided hope. Trust in workplace environments had proven more reliable than trust in individual romantic possibilities, because institutional recognition was based on demonstrated value rather than personal chemistry. The loyalty he now showed was to professional excellence and organizational contribution, loyalties that would persist and grow regardless of any individual customer's presence or absence from his work environment. What made his response particularly sophisticated was how it demonstrated that moving beyond workplace betrayal doesn't require forgetting or forgiving. It requires finding alternative sources of meaning and satisfaction that make the original disappointment irrelevant to ongoing happiness and professional effectiveness. She'd returned to find someone who had successfully transformed personal setback into professional advancement, someone who had learned to separate his sense of worth and purpose from any individual relationship's success or failure. The professional setting had provided him with opportunities for growth and recognition that existed independently of romantic outcomes, opportunities that had proven more sustainable and satisfying than the emotional validation he'd once sought through customer relationships. His decision to maintain appropriate distance wasn't about punishment or resentment. It was about protecting the emotional clarity and professional focus that had enabled his advancement and continued to serve his well-being. The aprendizado embedded in this interaction extended far beyond their individual history to encompass fundamental truths about how professional environments can become sources of transformation and growth when approached with commitment to institutional excellence rather than personal validation. The deception he'd experienced had been completely transformed into superação through the practical application of understanding that workplace satisfaction comes from meaningful contribution rather than reciprocated attention, from institutional recognition rather than individual approval, from professional advancement rather than romantic success. The institutional lesson embedded in his promotion and her return reveals essential truths about how workplace environments can provide redemption and transformation for people who approach professional setbacks with commitment to growth rather than attachment to grievance. His advancement demonstrated that organizations recognize and reward the kind of emotional intelligence that allows people to maintain effectiveness despite personal disappointment, to separate job performance from romantic investment, to transform setbacks into wisdom about sustainable workplace relationships. The professional setting had become a laboratory for developing the kind of emotional regulation and boundary setting that serves both individual well-being and organizational effectiveness. The trust his supervisors had placed in him through promotion reflected their observation that he'd learned to navigate complex social dynamics without allowing personal feelings to compromise professional responsibilities. The loyalty he now showed was to institutional excellence and personal growth, loyalties that would continue to provide satisfaction and advancement regardless of any individual relationship's outcome. The superação demonstrated in his response to her return was complete. The transformation from someone who needed romantic validation to maintain professional motivation into someone who could find sustainable satisfaction through meaningful work, institutional recognition, and the kind of emotional wisdom that serves both personal well-being and professional advancement throughout an entire career. Don't let these insights become just another collection of interesting stories you once heard. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you can continue developing the emotional intelligence that will serve you throughout your entire career. The next video will reveal even more sophisticated strategies for navigating the complex dynamics that determine success and satisfaction in professional environments. Your future self, the one with clearer boundaries, better information, and sustainable sources of workplace satisfaction,